Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about practices. So let's get into it. Now, practices. What do I mean by practices? Because practices, that's a really, really big topic. But for this little conversation of ours, we're going to scope practices to basically things that are happening in your project. These are not even best practices, these are just things that you at your company do, or rather that when you start at a company, you will most likely find that someone at some point is going to tell you something along the lines that, oh yeah, this is the way we do this is this or that way, and so forth and so forth. And I wanted to touch on this because this is something that I struggled with a little bit when well, not necessarily. Okay, yeah, technically it was when I was starting out, but I'm gonna be honest. This was with me for quite a while. It was only in recent time where I started to ask myself a very fundamental question, and we'll touch on that in just a moment. So the way it used to work for me was that whenever I came to a project, when I started a new job or anything of that nature, and somebody had written code before me, I started reading through the code and trying to, as you work, you start seeing things in the code base and you start to see emerging patterns, basically. These emerging patterns are usually practices, something that you at your company are doing for some reason. And what I often found was that these practices weren't really in line with the sort of thing that you would expect someone on a tech conference or a Uncle Bob or a Martin Fowler type of person to be telling you to be doing. Like there were these practices where you kind of saw immediately that, okay, I can understand how this is supposed to work and I understand how it works, but is this not really all that great? It's not that good. It could have been nicer. Maybe I should fix that. And that's always the case. That's always the case. As soon as you start questioning the practices, you start thinking about, at least I did, can I make this better? Can I improve it? Because I know all these cool techniques and I know all these awesome other practices that are so much better. They're going to make everything much better, most likely going to be more performant. It's going to be easier to test these things, yada, 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 yada. And for a long time, that was actually the norm I had. I would look at something that I thought that I knew this rule, the Boy Scout rule. The Boy Scout rule states that anytime you see something that could be a little bit nicer, you should try to improve things. You should make things nicer. And it's only in recent time when I realized how wrong that is. This is a controversial one. How could I even begin to question a rule that has been around for so long? Just relax, everybody. I am not saying that the Boy Scout rule isn't genius. I'm just saying that the way that I thought about that rule, and most likely how some of you think about that rule, may not actually be correct. Let me explain why. You see, the Boy Scout rule is basically the idea that when you see ugly code or something that is not nice, you should try to improve it or you should try to fix it, which makes you think, at least I did, you think refactor. That's every single time I think refactor. But if you think about it, when you refactor something, how do you know that the thing that you're refactoring is actually going to become a nicer thing than what it already is? Because nice code is subjective to a lot of people. There is ugly code. There are things that are really bad practices that a lot of people will look and say and basically say, oh, this is not really nice. But what determines what's a nice code and what's not nice code is actually very contextual. It's very much up to your company or the people that you work with to determine what nice code is. And if you show it to the world is going to be very divided. There is no way for you to say that, hey, this is definitively nice code. It's not possible because it's extremely subjective what nice code is. So that means that when you start refactoring something, you're doing one of two things, and most likely both at the same time. First and foremost, what you're doing is that when you're refactoring something, unless you are 100% sure that the thing that you are refactoring is not a practice, because we're going to talk about the practices in just a moment. if you're 100% certain that it's just ugly code, you can kind of figure that out. You'll just talk to somebody in your company who is a little bit more senior than you and ask, hey, is this really intended to be this way? And if they say yeah, then it's a practice. If they say no, then it's most likely just really ugly code. They'll actually tell you if it's just ugly code. And maybe then you should refactor it. But what's happening if you don't make that, if you don't ask if this is an intended thing, and then the more important question becomes, why is it an intended thing? And you start refactoring, you're actually going to simply change something in favor of what you yourself want for the project. So if you're breaking a practice in order to give the project, introduce something new to the project, such as your personal best practice or something that somebody else has said, odds are that you are simply going to, you're not going to add any value. Because your practices are subjective. The thing that you know is so great and so awesome doesn't necessarily mean that it is to everybody else. And that's a harsh truth. It doesn't matter how good you are at what you do, because the practices that have been set in the project are not for you. This is extremely tough for specialists or gurus or people who are really, really good at what they do, because genius programmers who want to write genius code very quickly, unless they really, really try, they realize that pushing the idea of fancy, sophisticated code is actually very tricky, because it's the same type of idea. Let's take a race car driver. If you take a race car driver and put that person on the roads in a regular old car, that person has to adapt to everybody else, because even though the race car driver in theory could drive that car better than anybody else on the road, in legally speaking, they should be able to drive as fast as they want. Just bear with me, because they have the skills necessary to do that. But they're not allowed to, for the same reason that you should not be trying to break practices without making sure that you're actually adding value to the product. Your Boy Scout rule idea to just refactor ugly code may not necessarily be what you think it is, because it might be that the code that you see in front of you is written in the way it's written because it's easy for everybody who's working at the project to actually adopt that practice. It may not be the best code in the world, but it's code that is maintainable over time. It's something that everybody in the company, or rather theoretically, everybody on the team, or everybody who's going to take care of this project can understand. It's a well-known practice. It's not the best practice, but it's well-known. And there's actually a lot of value in that. Exactly as with the race car driver. The race car driver has to adapt to everybody else. The same thing goes for you and your practices. So that's one part of the whole thing. The other part, when it comes to breaking practices or trying to refactor things or doing sort of things of that nature, is that you always take a risk. There's always a risk involved in refactoring something or changing something about your code. Two things are at risk. Number one is that you have a programming issue. Just fixing legacy code or fixing issues in a code base, really, really ugly code, is a risk in of itself. Odds are that you are going to break. If it's extremely complicated logic, it's actually very likely that you, after the refactor, will have introduced a regression, a bug, something like that. The second thing is that if you have, as I said, if you are establishing a new practice, you're moving things in a different direction, that is going to start creating questions that you're not going to have these questions, but the people who come after you, your colleagues, maybe not even them will have a question about it, because you're going to explain it to them. But the person who has your job after you is going to ask questions, because they're going to look at that project and they're going to see, okay, why are you doing things in this way over here, and then you're doing something completely different over here? What's the reason behind that? Now, that may not be a big problem, or it could be a very big problem. It kind of depends on what the issue is. If you change a few syntactical things about your code, or you're changing your methods, or a little bit of that nature, that's not maybe a big problem, because at the end of the day, the programmer is still going to understand what's going on. But what if your authentication method changes? The way that you store users. What if you start mixing different architecture patterns? What if one part of the code base is using MVC and another one is using something like event-driven programming, or you do something much larger than changing this little piece of code? You're actually changing the overall idea of how a critical piece of software in the system is working. That is going to be very risky for you. It's going to be very risky for the project. So when you start thinking about changing practices or trying to improve code or doing the Boy Scout rule thing, however you define it, you always have to remember that the goal is not necessarily for you to write the most sophisticated, advanced, perfect code. The goal is to make a healthy project. And unfortunately for you, if you are the race car driver, that means that you do not get to stretch your muscles or stretch your abilities to the limit. You simply have to figure out what's the perfect fit for this project, because you, unfortunately, may be able to understand all these sophisticated, intelligent, genius ideas that you have. But it's not about you. It's about all the other drivers on the road. It's about them. They don't have your abilities. And because they don't have your abilities, you're the one who has to adjust. Or you have to switch. You have to go to a race car track and just drive around with other race car drivers. Those are your options. Have a great day.